All right, guys, welcome to week 7. So, tonight's what we'll like to accomplish tonight is we're going to finish up the chapter on sensation and perception by looking at one form of perception called Gestalt psychology. And then we'll start the next chapter on states of consciousness. And then next week, we'll finish that chapter on states of consciousness. And that puts your next exam. Let's see here. Your next exam, then, if we finish up next week, that's the 3rd. So November 10th should be the date when you'll be ready to take your Unit 2 exam. All right, so having said that, let's take a look at Gestalt psychology. So Gestalt psychology was an influential school of thought that emerged out of Germany under the leadership of Max Wertheimer during the first half of the 20th century. The Gestalt psychologists were very interested in form perception. Gestalt is actually a German word for form or shape. So, in studying form perception, the Gestalts repeatedly demonstrated that the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. That's what we mean by Gestalt. The whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts that make it up. So, a simple example of this principle is the phi phenomena. So, the phi phenomena is an illusion where movement is created by presenting visual stimuli in rapid succession. Right now, you see smooth motion. But in reality, the moving objects merely take slightly different positions in successive frames. So viewed as a whole, the animation has the property, motion, that isn't evident in any of its parts, the individual frames. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on the different buttons to vary the speed at which the animation plays, and then you can compare the whole to its constituent parts, the parts that make it up. So this is 30 frames per second, 7 frames per second, and then 2 frames per second. And as you slow it down, you can start to see how that perception of motion disappears. So now if you look at this picture, the question is, do you see the faces against a white background, or do you see a white vase against a black background? This is another type of Gestalt phenomena called figure and ground. So when we divide visual displays into figure and ground, it's a fundamental way people organize visual perception. The figure is the thing being looked at, and the ground is the background against which it stands. Figure and ground are not usually interchangeable, but they are in this reversible figure. So the question is, do you see a saxophone player here or a woman's face? It depends on what you see as the figure and what you see as the ground. Okay, let's take a look at some of the Gestalt principles next. Frequently, your visual field may contain many figures shading a background. Many of the Gestalt principles relate to how these figures are grouped together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on each of the Gestalt principles to show you some examples of those principles. So the first one is the proximity principle. The proximity principle asserts that things that are near one another seem to belong together. The black dots in this illustration could be grouped into either vertical columns or horizontal rows. However, people tend to perceive rows because the dots are closer together horizontally. I'll give you another example of that here. You could use this illustration to see 8 separate lines, but thanks to the proximity principle, you're much more likely to view it as 4 pairs of lines. All right, now let's look at similarity. People tend to group stimuli that are alike. The similarity principle is apparent in this illusion, where we group elements of similar darkness into the number 2. Here's another example of that. You could view this illustration as horizontal rows containing varied shapes. But because we tend to group similar shapes, you are more likely to see vertical columns of squares and triangles. Then, continuity principle. So the continuity principle reflects people's tendency to follow in whatever direction they've been led. Thus, people tend to connect points that result in straight or gently curved lines that create smooth paths as shown here. I'll show you another example of continuity principle. Although the scene on the top could be created by two branches, as shown below, we tend to assume that there is only one branch because of our preference for continuity. Now look at the closure principle. People often group elements to create a sense of closure. Thus, you may complete figures that actually have gaps in them. The closure principle is apparent in these illustrations. So here, you see a circle. Here you see what looks like a dog. I'll show you another example of closure. So even though these illustrations are incomplete, you fill in the blanks and you see a square and an elephant. And then last, the law of good form. The Gestalt's most general principle was the law of good form. This principle essentially asserts that people tend to organize forms in the simplest way possible. For example, you tend to see this illustration as made up of the elements shown in the simplest alternative instead of more complex alternatives, even though they could represent its structure equally well. Give you another example of the law of good form. You could view this as a complicated 11-sided illustration, but given our preference for simplicity, you are more likely to see it as a rectangle and a triangle. Although Gestalt psychology is no longer an active theoretical orientation in modern psychology, its influence is still felt in many areas, and it left a legacy for many useful insights about form perception.